All right. Ooh, that's a little loud. I know Joe has a mic. Who else has a mic? Did you give it to anybody? Jason Aiken has a mic. All right. Let's we're on page 17, right over top of it. Lesson 6. Remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy. Jason, why don't you lead us in prayer and we'll get started.
Lord, thank you for this day that we've been given. Thank you for keeping us safe in our travels, allowing us to get here in one piece. We're thankful for the time that we have to just study your word, and we just pray that we are able to open our hearts and just use what we come across, Lord, and allow us to apply it to our life. We pray that you be with Terry as we go over this, and we just pray that we have good interaction and a good responsive group today. We pray this all in your son's name. Amen.
Amen. So we come to the fourth commandment, which is the first of two commandments that are actually spoken of in a positive way, presented positively. The other 8 are all you shall not. But this commandment and the commandment concerning parents are both more imperative you shalls. Let's read verse 8 through 11. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. In his book on the 10 Commandments, Brian Edwards says that the fourth command is a bridge between the first 3 commands and the final 6. Why would he say that? And do you agree with that? Maybe is a better question. Because what we generally do, by the way, is we generally think of the commands divided into 4 and 6. 4 that deal with the Lord your God, loving the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind, and the last 6 that deal with loving your neighbor as yourself. His suggestion is it's a transition of sort between those. Joe?
Yeah, I struggled with it to start with, trying to figure out what he was, because I didn't look up his information. But it strikes me that it is, because when you look at the way that it's constructed, it includes others, and it includes really everybody on the list. There's seven listed, you all the way down to the sojourner. But everybody past you is someone in your care, someone who you have power over, or something that you have power over. So in a sense, God's offering his Sabbath, but you are offering the Lord's Sabbath to those who are in your control. And so it's the way you're treating it. It leans into the way you treat others and the way you treat God. So it's a bridge in that sense. That may not be what the guy had in mind, but that's where it hit me. Sure. Ultimately.
Sounds good. Anybody else? I think part of where he's getting with this is that the first 3 really deal with how we view God. And the last 6 deal with our interaction with each other. And while there is others here in these verses, the idea here is in this middle command, or the fourth command, is there's a portion of this that is about God, about keeping it holy because God's made it holy. It's worship and reverence to God in that sense. And the Sabbath becomes an integral day for the Jew in that sense. But also, this is about mankind. Even beyond the idea that it's about you giving this to other people, we changed from commandments in the first three that look and focus on God to the commandments, the last six, that focus on mankind. And there is a sense to which this commandment does both. Focuses on God, but focuses also on humans, including ourselves. It's interesting, and we'll look at Mark 2 later. But remember what Jesus said in Mark 2, that the man wasn't made for the Sabbath, but Sabbath was made for man. And I think what's interesting about that is I'm not sure that we, in our traditional way of approaching this, really give that the proper space it deserves of how the Sabbath interacts and impacts mankind. And so we're going to try to do that some tonight. What was the Sabbath and what was its origin? Where's the origin of the Sabbath? Genesis 2. You turn back there in Genesis chapter 2. Of course, chapter 1 ends with this proclamation. God saw everything he made, and behold, it was very good. And that idea is it's all exactly as God wanted it to be, what he intended it to be. And then it says in verse 1 of chapter 2, thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day, God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. Why did God rest? Do you think God was just exhausted from creation? That these 6 days wore him out? I mean, because, okay, it could be that he's viewing what his creation is. Here's another question. Why did God take 6 days to create the earth? Jillian has her hand up, by the way. Is it not possible that God could have created the world in an instant? Or is his power limited that it took this amount of time, and then at the end of 6 days, he's just wore out? Jillian?
I think he he rested that seventh day as a plan for his people to spend a day meditating on him and not thinking anything else. That you're only thinking on him and his creation, and it's set up as a monument type thing to recognize the days that he created.
Okay.
Memorial, not monument.
All right. Have you noticed that the whole world operates on a 7-day week? You know that mathematically that doesn't make sense? If you take the lunar calendar, 7 days don't really work. I mean, 73 weeks of 5 days would be much more clear. Or maybe 59 weeks of 6 days would be 364, I believe it is, or 354, which is the other calendar. I mean, there was other ways to divide up the calendar in ways that make more mathematical sense. In fact, here's what's interesting. There have been people who have tried to reorganize the calendar in those ways. It's not stuck. You still operate on a 7-day week. And it's interesting because, you realize that's why we have some months that have 31 days and some that have 28, 29, depending on the year. And you have your birthday doesn't occur on the same day of the week back to back, does it? Because we operate on a 7-day work week. And since the beginning, man has operated on a 7-day work week. God didn't create the earth in 6 days because that's as quick as he could do it, or it was too tiring. And he didn't rest on the seventh day in order to recover from the difficulty of creation. God worked 6 days and rested the seventh to show man how to work and rest and to hold this 7-day week. Now, what is interesting about that is, by the time we get to Exodus 20, there are some who view this almost as, well, this is a command in the covenant and it didn't exist before. But the origins are from Genesis 2. And the idea here is that, we'll talk about over later on in Exodus about this idea of a covenant, but it's more of a sign from the covenant, not the covenant. What does the word Sabbath mean? There's a time as a kid I used to think it meant seventh. It makes sense, right? Sabbath, seventh, sounds kind of similar. What's that? A day of rest and worship? Okay. It's really just a stoppage or a cessation or a rest. Yeah. The Sabbath, the Hebrew word Sabbath, just means to stop. To stop and to rest. You ever heard the idea or the term a sabbatical? Yeah, we all want one of those. What's a sabbatical? Well, there's more than PhDs that take them, but usually it's a paid vacation for someone to stop their work and recover, to rest. Same root word here, same word. Here's what's interesting is the command says to remember the Sabbath day and to keep it what? Holy. Look again in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 3. How does Genesis 2 and verse 3 start out? God blessed the seventh day and made it holy because on it God rested from all his work he'd done in creation. What the command says in Exodus 20 is the same thing God said about it in Genesis chapter 2. It's the idea of rest and a day that is holy. You were asked to find the 3 different actions mentioned in this command. What'd you find? There's 3, I said actions, couldn't find a good word, but there's 3 things mentioned in here really that help make this command. What are they? Nobody? Raise your hand if you got a... We got rest, that's the easy one. Okay, work, rest, worship. Hard, was it? In this sense, that there is, I believe, here the idea of keeping it holy, that man is to rest from his work. He's to work those 6 days, he's to rest, and he's to remember the day and keep it holy. And I think here's the part of this that we need to kind of tie together and understand. I'm trying to find my notes here as I say this, is that this day has been set apart by God for a special purpose, but also it is a day that has been set apart for people to stop their labor and stop their work and to remember God in that process. And all 3 of those things are in the context of the 4th command, because the remembering to keep it holy And the Sabbath day does become this day, this holy day. And we see that even in the New Testament, that idea is still carried forth with the synagogue practices and so forth. That you stop this work so you can not only rest, but also focus on the Lord. And that's a part of this day as well. Joe?
Yeah, this kind of gets into the area where it gets a modern day connotation that this did not exist. It does not exist. First off, the synagogue practice would not have happened for another 1,000 years.
That's correct.
From this point. So in all the commandments, he says, in your dwelling, in your personal dwelling, you are to stop. And it was a family-oriented event. And it's still observed that way, still in Israel today, that it's a family event. Now, not that they don't go to, not that they don't go to the temple, because they do, but when we think of worship, the other 6 feasts are much more like worship in the way we think about it.
There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, I'm just saying that's the muddiness between Sabbath and.
But there is an idea here that this is more than just vacation one day a week.
No, I don't disagree with that. I don't disagree that God's at the center of it, but God's also protecting mankind, and he's protecting his creation when saying, you know, your livestock, you are to show Shabbat to your son, your daughter, to the sojourner, and he specifically says the sojourner in your gate, the person that you have some control over, that you're reflecting God's Shabbat to others, and that's your role. It's a mini role of being an icon of him. And
but the idea of that this was also a sacred day.
Yeah, I'm not denying that.
So it's
I'm just
both.
saying
So it's,
organized worship is not.
No, not saying it's organized worship, but they were until later with the synagogue it became that. But they were in their homes supposed to remember God and to keep things holy. It was a day to stop your work, be with those within your household, and to be holy, sacred, and remember God. In that sense, that is worship. And I think that's the thing we have to understand. That doesn't mean that they all went to the temple on that day. In fact, they couldn't unless they lived within 200 steps of the temple. Later on, when those rules were concocted. The idea, though, here is that there is this day that's set aside for maybe a better term is there's a religious part of this day. It's unlike the other days. Now, they were supposed to teach and those things every day and along the way, and it doesn't mean that this is when they went to church. That's not the idea. But this day was set apart so you didn't go to work, and part of that was to stay with your people and remember the sacred part of the day. And there's a sense of that is worship, that is holiness. And I think it's hard for at least I think we struggle with that concept because when we have a day off, it's all about being our day. It's about, and we can do what we want to do on our day off. They could not. And that got more ridiculous as time went on, for sure. And we'll talk about some of that here in a minute. But I'm not suggesting that they only offered sacrifices on the Sabbath. They offered sacrifices all the time. They were continual. There was always a burnt offering going up, essentially, of some kind. So,
yeah, there's actually no difference in the Sabbath sacrifice versus the daily sacrifice.
Correct.
2 lambs, and then the 2.
The only time it's different if it's within the context of a feast day.
Of one of the other 6 feast days, right.
And I understand the feast days are higher forms of worship than this, but they're not in the 10 Commandments. So that's another study. Yeah.
And all I'm saying is just the muddiness that has occurred in making it, in calling today the Christian Sabbath.
No, we've not even got to that. No.
I'm just starting early on that.
Yeah, don't. Now your muddiness is getting in the way. So we just want to point out this commandment talks about work, rest, and there's a sacred part of this day. There are 3 parts to this: work, rest, holiness. Okay? And that's important because it establishes this concept. And I will tell you, I think this is one of the problems. I don't want to overemphasize the holiness because of this. What truly this commandment is about more than the holiness is the rest. That's truly what this is about more than anything else. And we do overlook that almost completely in our application. But we do want to make sure we notice just for a while that there is a holiness to this. Now, the next question was Exodus 31. Did God intend for this to be an eternal covenant? Because that's another thought, right? In fact, that's why if you have friends that are Seventh-day Adventists, they still meet on the Sabbath, is because Exodus 31 says this is an eternal covenant. Is that what that means? Mike.
I thought that was an interesting verse you pulled out because it specifies the Israelites.
Yes.
So, no.
Is it for them then?
Yeah, they got to do it. Israelites got to do it. Not today.
Right. It's eternal as long as that covenant stood. But it was tied to the covenant. That's the idea. We'll get to Colossians 2 in just a little bit. Was man the only part of creation that received a Sabbath or rest? No. Every 7th year, the land was to lie dormant and rest. Which, by the way, and this is where I think also there's a part of this holiness that we don't make a connection until we get to this. You know, it's not a big deal really every 7th day to take a day off because you can work hard the other 6 days and eat. But letting your land sit completely in a restful state for an entire year, no harvest at all, requires a lot of faith and dependence that God's going to see you through. And there is a part of this there's a part of this concept of rest that is always tied to God. And as we get further into the new covenant, that's made more clear that this rest can only be found in God, the real true rest. So it's important, the sabbatical land. And there were other things that went with that. And then, of course, the year of Jubilee. Again, great, fascinating study. Not our assignment tonight. We're not going to get bogged down with that, but fascinating stuff. Now, to get more to what Joe was talking about, are we under a requirement to keep the Sabbath today? Why? Okay. But does that mean that Sunday has become, as Joe mentioned, the Christian Sabbath? Which, by the way, that is not as popular as it once was, but still is pretty popular in the South. But 20 years ago, if you were out mowing your yard on a Sunday afternoon, you might get rocks thrown at you. Because that's the Christian Sabbath. You don't do that. Now, by the way, let me say something. There is no nap better than a Sunday afternoon nap. Okay? Yeah, most amens I've gotten since I moved here. And if I don't, and here's the other thing. When I don't get my Sunday afternoon nap, it's bad. Okay? It's bad. I'll have to take one on Monday. And it just don't hit the same. Right? Just don't hit the same. But that really gets to the heart of this command. It's not about that Sunday is a Sabbath. It is about this. And there's not been a culture probably that's ever existed that need to know this better than we do. You're supposed to learn that you've got to take rest. Man needs rest. And that's really part of what's going on here, is that there is a deep need for us to not work 7-day work weeks. Joe?
And just circling back to what you said, and not really focusing on the muddiness between the Christian Sabbath, but going back to Exodus 16, where he implements this concept that they were supposed to not collect more of the manna, and
Yeah.
he would take care of them on the Sabbath, and he shows that by they
Yes.
could collect twice as much the day before the Sabbath, and then that manna would not go bad.
And if they collected more than twice as much, it would go bad.
It would go bad unless it was being collected for the Sabbath. But,
Correct.
and it just shows that God's care is all. So he wanted this trust built into the Sabbath, and it was this concept. Well, no, I got to get out there and work, or I can't eat, or
Yeah.
my field has got to be plowed this seventh year, or I won't eat. And he's saying, no, trust me, trust me, and that's what he's trying to build into his people, and that's one of the reasons I was moving away from the central concept being worship, and that is worship, but I'm just saying organized worship. That's not
No.
what the
Yeah.
Shabbat was about.
No, and the central concept is rest. That's
Trust, rest
yeah,
and trust.
Rest and trust in God. And here's the part again where this is where our disconnect is. We think of rest as, oh man, I worked so hard I get to rest now. They thought of rest, or at least the intention is, I've worked hard, but now God will take care of me and I can rest. And that's a difference between those two. And that's part of, that understanding, by the way, is part of what it means to keep the day holy, is the recognition of what God has done to provide you that day. That's where the worship comes into play. But the primary focus is not worship, but it is part of that. We have to acknowledge. Yes, Eric.
Of those 10 commandments, it's the one commandment that's a backhanded to do, to rest. And man proves he can't even do that right. And you know, the other commands are just, you know, you don't murder, you don't do. This one is a specific order. Hey, you do nothing. You do nothing today. You don't work today, and we can't even do that right. It just again shows us how much we need Jesus.
Yeah. I was looking for here it is. Making sure I find that. Yeah, we don't do this well at all. Here's what's interesting is to really, what I find most entertaining, we've talked about this a little bit, is what the Jews do with the idea or the concept of the Sabbath, and how this prohibition of doing anything, they had more, not laws, but explanations for how to keep the Sabbath than any other thing in the old law. You could travel 2,000 cubits from home, but that was it. Now, they overcame this restriction. If the night before the Sabbath you put some food 2,000 cubits from your house, then you could get to that spot and proclaim that that's your new home, and you could go another 2,000 cubits. That seemed kind of silly. You could be more subtle than this. You couldn't really leave your building without that count against your steps. I think it's always funny about, you know, today I'm sure they have the Apple Watch keeping up with it for them. Because, now listen, the Orthodox Jews still practice this stuff. I'll explain an example of that in a minute. But if you connected your house by rope to the house next door to you, then they're connected and they become one residence, and that doesn't count against your steps because now you live in the same house. You were supposed to extinguish the household fire because you were not allowed to cook. You weren't even allowed to bake an egg in the sun on the Sabbath. You could not saddle your donkey unless you could not ride your donkey unless you saddled him the day before the Sabbath. Because if you saddled him the day before the Sabbath, then you didn't work saddling your donkey. Dress was controlled. Women were not allowed to wear any pin or jewelry in the Sabbath, because if you took it off to show a friend, now you're carrying a burden on the Sabbath. If you cut your finger, you could put a piece of fabric over it to stop the bleeding. But if you thought that in doing so you actually were healing your finger from being cut, you could not do that because that would break the law of keeping the Sabbath, which is why they come to Jesus in Luke about healing a man on the Sabbath, healing the woman. That sound crazy? Hold on. You were allowed to dip a radish in salt, but you could not leave it in too long or you would be picking it at that point. Picking it. Because if it's set in the salt too long, it's the equivalent of picking it out of the ground. You could dip it, but not let it sit there. If you found some dirt on your dress, you could brush it off, but if you rub it, that would be work. If you throw something in the air and catch it with the same hand, that would be fine, but if you caught it with the other hand, that is work. If you were moving hay for animals, you use a different hand than the one you use during the week. If you fed the animals with the right hand, on the Sabbath you feed them with the left hand. Listen to this one about the chickens. If a hen was being fattened for the table, laid an egg, the egg could be eaten since egg laying was not the hen's daily work. However, if an egg-laying hen laid an egg on the Sabbath, she was working and that egg could not be eaten.
Now, we're having some fun here, but
Yeah.
I want to give a little context on how this got started. So just the big one, how far you could travel on the Sabbath.
Right.
They actually in their mind calculated the distance from the furthest tribe to the tabernacle, and that was the original distance. Now all this other stuff is developed through the centuries, but early on they were being serious about, okay, we want to honor God, and you can see where this can head.
And and let me say this about all this. We laugh about that. I would suggest to you that sometimes with our own heritage we can be just as ridiculous. Just as a side note. And we got to be careful that we're not. Yes, they had good intentions, but even today, if you go into the places in New York City, for instance, and you look up at the right time of day, you will see in the air a fishing line that marks a corridor where you can walk on the Sabbath and it not count against your steps. This is such a big deal, by the way, that on what we call Black Friday, the rabbis go through the streets of New York to fix the fishing wire that has been knocked down by the balloons in the Macy Day Parade. And I found this out. Eric Pruitt sent me an article about 3 weeks ago. We were talking about something, and sent me an article about all this, and I was just like, okay, well, we're still doing this thing, right? I mean, think about that. And this is a lot like 1 Kings 19, where you have these prophets of Baal that are dancing around the altar. And in one sense, you look at them and you may feel pity for what they do, thinking that their God's going to light the fire. And in one sense, you may look at them and you may mock them because they actually think this God's going to light their fire. But there's another sense where you have to look at them and realize anybody that will dance around an altar for 6 hours and even go to the point of cutting themselves is sincere in their faith. They're sincere in their faith. Now, they're misguided and their faith is in the wrong thing. And I think the same is true about some of this. I mean, we can joke about a little bit about how crazy this got. It also helps you understand why they do what they do with Jesus in regards to the Sabbath and all of these different rules. And it wasn't just the idea of the Sabbath, the washing of hands. A lot of things came into this tradition that Jesus talks about. Now, in Mark 2, here Jesus and his disciples are walking through the fields and they're plucking the grains of Sabbath. The charge is not thievery, right? Because they're not stealing. They're allowed to do that. The charge is they're working as they're plucking heads of grain. Jesus, in his response there, by the way, compares himself to who? And what did David do? Compares himself to David when David ate the showbread. Was David allowed to eat the showbread? No. And yet God did not condemn David for eating the showbread. I will tell you that one of the things that I read this week that I think really I had not connected is there's a part of this story where here is David eating forbidden bread, and here is Jesus and his followers eating forbidden grain in a sense that they're plucking it on the Sabbath. But yet in both stories, what's really the proclamation? What's Jesus really tying that back to? David eats the showbread as the Lord's anointed who will soon take the throne. And there is a connectivity of Jesus is doing the same thing. He does say he's Lord of the Sabbath. We're not got to that yet, but we're talking about here where there is a kind of a shadowy pronouncement of, I'm about to take the throne. I'm about to be king. Now, what do we learn from this text, though? What's the real takeaway from this text? Yeah. Man was not made for the Sabbath, but Sabbath was made for man. And of course, he's Lord of the Sabbath because he was there when the Sabbath was created, and he's there when Sabbath is commanded in Exodus 20. And his point, though, is really that, listen, the Sabbath is there because it's what man needs, not what God needs from man. Which gets to the point earlier of what Joe was saying and what I agree with. This isn't about worship to God primarily. This is about rest for man primarily. The connection to God is part of that, but it's primarily about rest. And that's important to kind of understand. It's also important to understand this. Man needs rest. Man also needs to eat. And in the sense, Jesus and his disciples are eating what God has provided through the law on the Sabbath, which I think is something that's interesting to see there too. Brandon, you got.
I was just going to say, that every one of these commandments, even though we might think that they do one thing or another, they're all to be a blessing to man. Every single one of them. I mean, when we think about reverencing God and not having any other idols above him, it tells us why. This command especially tells us why rest is important for us. And God didn't make it for himself. He made it for us. It's to be a blessing for us. We can turn it into work. We can turn it into a curse, but and the Jews, in some ways, they've made it to where it's such a law keeping that you can't even rest on the day of rest because you have to worry about doing everything on the day of rest. But I mean, even the other commandments, about your father and mother, that's, if you obey that, it's a blessing. If you don't kill somebody, that's a blessing. Every one of these commandments is for us.
Yeah, I think one of the things to realize too, and that is that's not just this command or any. It's the entire law that Israel did that with. They viewed it as a checklist of things to keep and as a law. And we sometimes still look at it the same way. And the reality is the yoke of Jesus is easy, but Israel got a pretty easy yoke too, in one sense. They were given a land. All they had to do was trust. They walked in, the table was still set. I mean, there's a lot of things here that and at the end of the day, the law then was a blessing, but they did not choose to keep it that way. It made them God's people. It was a reflection of God. The covenant made them God's people. There's a whole host of things there where this was a blessing. And they just didn't see it that way. We make the same mistake too, by the way. I've been asked by people, where's the list of commands I got to keep today? We do it the same way. Listen, the reality is, if you came tonight because that's part of your checklist to go to heaven, you're here for the wrong reasons. This is supposed to be a blessing to you. So that's important to kind of see that's just that's a man problem, truthfully. It's not an old covenant problem. It's not a new covenant problem. It's a man problem is what it is. It's a human problem. Joe?
Yeah, and just the fact that it's not just a cessation of your physical body. When you put your trust in the Lord, He's freeing you from anxiety. He's
Yeah.
freeing you from
Oh,
the
yeah.
thing that burdens you. Even you talk about, you can go out and work 10 hours and not feel nearly as tired as your mind being anxious for 10 hours.
Yeah.
And He's saying, here it is. Here, this is your day. Don't be anxious about what you're going to eat, any of
Right.
these things. Trust in me. And then give your body a rest. And that's,
Yeah. Yeah. By the way, in Luke 13, we're just going to skip over that because we got like 5 minutes left. So let's get back to this Christian Sabbath because we did ask the question, then we'll get to Colossians 2. Here's the bottom line about this Christian Sabbath kind of idea. To get to that point, first off, from a biblical standpoint, you got to make a lot of connections that just aren't there. It's just not there. From a what does the Scripture say? In fact, you look at the practice of the early church, especially in Acts, what you typically see is that the apostles were commonly observing the Sabbath and going and worshiping on the Lord's day. And they saw them as two different things. And so they did not make the connection people are trying to make. I will say this, though. I don't think that we're under an obligation then to take what we call the Lord's Day and necessarily keep it holy in that same sense. But I do wonder if we've not lost something by no longer observing the Lord's day, so to speak, and really just observing the Lord's hour. I think there's a part of us that needs, and by the way, this just isn't about worship, but I think there's a part of us, and I can tell you with my family, I see this. There's a part of us that needs that day where all of our family is together in one place and we're just resting. And we're just together and not working and not going and not doing. And traditionally speaking, for me growing up, and for most of us, that used to be Sunday. And I wonder, because we demand so much, our rest today is totally my time, in other words. It's my rest. And if I want to go golf on my rest, it's my rest. If I want to go fishing on my rest, it's my rest. And I'm not saying those things are bad, but I do think there needs to be some acknowledgement more than we do. By the way, there needs to be some acknowledgement about our work. We think it's my work and my wages. Everything you have, your work, your wages, and your rest come from God. We fail to make those connections. The ancients were far more connected to the idea that everything that happened, God caused. And we've gone almost to the other extreme of that God causes very little. It either happens by circumstance or by sure will and determination. In Colossians chapter 2, we have about 3 minutes. The only thing I think we really need to point out here is this. In this section that talks about circumcision and shadows and covenants and things that no longer are bound in that sense, there is that statement that is made, therefore no longer let them judge you. And one of those things is on the idea of feast, but one of the things there is the Sabbath. Now, I think one of the things to keep in mind is this passage is not saying you can't observe the Sabbath. It is saying not to be judged based on whether you do or not. Dietary restrictions are listed in there. A lot of things that are not repeated in the same way in the gospel. That doesn't mean, and so you think about the dietary restrictions and the passages that talk about eating of meat. You know, there's passages in that tell you that it's okay to eat meat, but at the same time, don't offend somebody else who thinks you shouldn't eat meat. Don't be a stumbling block to them. And so from that standpoint, one of the things to kind of keep in mind about this is we are not required to keep the Sabbath. We are not required to do that. We're not required to keep the feast. At the same time, I know of a group that got together not too long ago, and they observed the Passover so that their young people could understand the context of the Passover. And the evangelist there posted a picture and talked about that. And he was just kind of really put in this place about how dare you do that. Excoriated, yeah. And the point here of this passage is we shouldn't be that way. Shouldn't be that way. In Hebrews, I'll fit this in. Where do we find our Sabbath rest today? Where do we find the Sabbath rest today? Right?
In Jesus.
Yeah. Ultimately in Jesus. Well, in Jesus, but ultimately our rest will come as our reward, ultimately. And in Hebrews, I think that's what Hebrews 11 and 12 really is painting the picture of, is these people endured these things, went through these things, so you have a cloud of witnesses to encourage you as you go through these things. And you do all of that, why? Because there is this eternal rest that is coming. There is this day of rest that will occur. Ultimately, our Sabbath in that sense will be after the judgment.
And there are Colossians that we have in the book. Just above that, too, is written him. I'm reading. This is American Standard and the NIV. Almost. Well, let me read it.
What verse?
13, 14. And you being dead through your trespasses and uncircumcision of your flesh, you, I say, did he make alive with him, having forgiven us all our trespasses, having blotted out the bond written in ordinances that was against us, which was contrary to us, and he hath taken it out of the way, nailing it to the cross. Would that be referencing the old law? The other versions of the Bible don't read that way.
No, the ESV says by canceling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands.
Right. But the NIV American.
Well, that's just a matter of, they're all referring to the same thing, which would be the old covenant in my understanding of that, because it is the legal demands that are against you and that define and in that sense expose your debt. And Jesus on the cross pays that. He also cancels that. It's not the best passage for that. The best passage of that really is in Hebrews, which is talking about a better covenant. And with, in order to have a New Testament, there's got to be the death of the testator. And you see this tie in to really the concept of last will and testament in the book of Hebrews. That's, to me, is a much better passage. But for a long time, this became the proof text of it's been nailed to the cross. It's been nailed to the cross. And I do think ultimately that's what it's saying. But again, I think for here, the point I want to make out is, even though that's been nailed to the cross and removed, and part of that includes the judgment on these things in verse 16. That's one of the reasons why, in this context, I have a hard time enforcing a Christian Sabbath, because the idea here is that concept is no longer something that is required like it was. Whatever in 13 and 14 was required is not required. And verse 16 is saying these things aren't required anymore. These things have been removed. Yeah, just like, circumcision physically has been removed. The spiritual circumcision that was expected to happen all along is still expected. But yes, that sign of the covenant. Here's another tie-in. Circumcision is a sign of the covenant in Exodus 31 and verse 17, which we didn't read. The Sabbath is a sign of the covenant as well. The Israelites looked different because they observed the Sabbath, and that was a sign that they were in this covenant with God. In that sense, they did something different than the rest of the people So those signs are gone. That covenant is gone. And that requirement's not there. Wrap all it up because we're way over time to say this. Here's the main thing. To get back to what Joe said, is absolutely right. The main takeaway from this command is man needs rest. Man needs a day, time to sit back and to rest, but not just to rest from work, but to rest and remember you're able to rest because of who God is. That's the ultimate connection of all of this. And I think one of the interesting things that has happened is we spend so much time in these classes on the Ten Commandments normally with this command, trying to make sure everybody knows you don't have to keep the Sabbath, that we don't get into the principle of the Sabbath, which really we still need today. And as I said in the introduction of the book, probably there's never been a time where we need rest more than today, especially first day of school week. I'm married to a teacher. So anyway, that's a side note. Brandon says amen, and we are done. Thank you. Jason doesn't even know yet.